It was a quiet Friday evening in Maplewood, the kind of night where the streets seemed to hold their breath, shadows stretching long across the empty sidewalks. The sun had vanished behind distant hills, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and dark indigos. A thin mist lingered, curling around the lampposts and perfectly manicured lawns, giving the neighborhood a ghostly, unreal quality. 16-year-old Sarah arrived at the Anderson household, her backpack heavy on one shoulder, a mixture of excitement and unease churning in her stomach. She had babysat before, but this house felt different tonight. As she approached the front porch, the flickering light cast unnatural shadows across the door and the wide steps. Each crunch of gravel under her shoes sounded amplified, almost as if the entire street was listening. The silence pressed against her ears, a quiet tension that made her hesitate before turning the knob and stepping inside the house. The Andersons had left detailed instructions, their concern clear in the way. They repeated one rule over and over. The children were never to go upstairs after bedtime. Tommy, 10 years old, was energetic but well-behaved, while 7-year-old Emily clung to routines and familiar stories. Sarah listened carefully, the words echoing in her mind even as the Andersons rushed off to their gala. Leaving her alone in the large house, the interior was pristine, every surface gleaming faintly in the dim evening light. The polished wood floors reflected shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, almost alive. The air carried the faint scent of dinner and cleaning products, but it was the quiet that truly unnerved her. Every creak of the floor sounded magnified, each sound bouncing off the walls as if the house itself were listening, waiting. Sarah had babysat before, yet never had she felt this oppressive tension. The sense that someone or something was already watching her from the darkness. Dinner went smoothly. Sarah prepared sandwiches, cut neatly, and arranged them on a plate for the children. Tommy laughed as they played board games, his joy a brief relief against the tension building around her. Emily listened closely to her bedtime story, curling under her blanket with wide eyes, fully immersed in the tale. By 9 o'clock, both children were asleep, tucked into their beds beneath the gentle glow of night lights. Sarah returned to the living room with her book, hoping for a quiet evening, but the stillness of the house pressed down on her like a weight. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, stretching along the walls and ceilings as if alive. Every floorboard creak, every soft tap from upstairs or the wind outside made her flinch. The house felt enormous and unfamiliar, filled with corners that might conceal secrets. Sarah tried to ignore the creeping unease, but deep down, she felt something stirring just beyond her perception. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the phone broke the silence. Sarah jumped, clutching the receiver with trembling hands. On the other end, there was only a low, deliberate breathing, slow and chilling, echoing through the line. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She hung up, trying to convince herself it was a misdialed number or a prank. Yet minutes later, the phone rang again. The voice was unmistakable this time, whispering in a way that made the hair on her arms stand. It warned her to check on the children, or there would be consequences she could not imagine. Sarah's heart raced, cold sweat forming across her brow. She tried calling the Andersons, but there was no response, the line dead. Her mind flashed with terror as she realized that the calls could only be coming from inside the house. Every locked door and shuttered window suddenly felt like a flimsy barrier against the unknown danger lurking within. Fear surged, but determination took over. She quietly crept upstairs, each step heavy with tension, the boards groaning under her weight. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and narrow, faintly illuminated by the nightlights in the children's rooms. The master bedroom window caught her attention. It was slightly open, a detail she was certain she had checked before. The house felt alive around her. Shadows twisted along the walls, and every whisper of the wind sounded like a footstep echoing from some hidden corner. She moved carefully to Emily's room. The little girl was huddled beneath the blankets, eyes wide with terror, and Tommy lay quietly in bed, whimpering softly. Sarah felt the oppressive atmosphere wrap around her, each breath heavier than the last. Somewhere above, steps descended, slow and deliberate, almost taunting her as she clutched the children to her chest. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet she knew the only way to save them was to face the unknown. With a surge of adrenaline, Sarah carried the children down the stairs, the house seemingly conspiring to slow her escape. Floorboards creaked under her every step. Doors shuddered as if pushed by invisible hands, and shadows darted at the edges of her vision. She burst through the front door, calling for help with every ounce of strength in her voice. Her screams carried into the night, reaching a neighbor who rushed out, eyes wide with concern, and immediately dialed the police. Sirens eventually cut through the night air, flashing lights illuminating the mist that hung low across the lawn. Officers entered the house and discovered the intruder hiding in the attic. He had been using a stolen cordless phone to terrorize Sarah, speaking from within the walls she thought were safe, though the children were unharmed. The memory of the night lingered, embedding a deep, lasting fear. Even after the intruder was arrested, the house refused to feel safe. The oppressive silence lingered like a living presence, pressing against Sarah's chest and following her through every room. She returned to babysit weeks later, attempting to reassure herself that what had happened was over, that the nightmare was behind her. But the moment she stepped inside, a shiver ran down her spine. The floors creaked in ways that seemed deliberate, the shadows curling at the edges of her vision. Every hallway seemed longer, every corner darker. Her imagination filled the spaces with possibilities that made her heart pound faster. Even when the children were calm and sleeping, Sarah's eyes darted constantly, scanning for movement, listening for whispers, and imagining the faint tap of footsteps descending from empty rooms above. She realized that the fear was no longer just about a person. It had seeped into the very walls of the house. The nights that followed were even worse. Sarah would awaken to the faintest sounds, the subtle shifting of a floorboard, the distant creak of a door, the whisper of a shadow moving across a wall. Her mind constantly replayed the memory of the phone calls, the raspy voice that had seemed to come from the very air around her. Sleep became elusive, and the children's presence offered little comfort. Sometimes, when she peered into their rooms, she thought she saw something lingering in the corners, a fleeting silhouette that disappeared when she looked directly. Even the house itself seemed to breathe, its walls tightening and loosening with every imagined footstep. Each night felt like a trial of courage, a test of whether she could survive another round of terror that had not yet revealed itself. The memory of the intruder was no longer just a memory. It had transformed into an ever-present specter, haunting her long after the police had left. Sarah's friends noticed the change in her demeanor. She became jumpy, constantly glancing over her shoulder, hesitant to speak too loudly or move too quickly. They attributed it to the stress of babysitting, but she knew it was more than that. The house had marked her. Even when she was elsewhere, the image of the intruder's unseen presence lingered in her mind, stalking her thoughts. Shadows appeared in her peripheral vision, fleeting and insistent. The very sound of a phone ringing could make her pulse spike, a conditioned terror that reminded her of the helplessness she had felt. Sleepovers and social outings became exercises in anxiety. Every unfamiliar sound made her think of the footsteps she had heard upstairs, the taps on the walls, the whispering voice that had seemed to exist both in the room and inside her mind. She understood then that fear, once experienced, leaves its mark, and some nights, the house felt alive with its memory. One evening, months later, Sarah returned to babysit for the Andersons, trying to convince herself that the fear had diminished. The children greeted her cheerfully, the house appearing calm, almost ordinary in its daylight form. But as night fell and the children went to bed, the familiar tension returned. The room seemed colder, the shadows longer. The wind outside rattled the windows, mimicking the tapping she had once heard in the empty hallways. When she went to check on the children, she swore she heard a soft whisper, almost too faint to distinguish but unmistakably human. Her breath caught in her throat and she froze, listening to the house. Every instinct screamed at her to run, yet she continued forward, convincing herself that it was her imagination. And yet deep down, she knew that some part of the intruder, some fragment of that terror, had not left. The house held secrets, Sarah realized. Objects would subtly shift when she wasn't looking. Doors that had been closed were slightly ajar. Windows that were locked appeared loose. The children sometimes complained of hearing footsteps in the hall at night, or of soft whispers calling their names. Though the intruder was gone, the house itself seemed to carry a memory, replaying the fear of that one terrifying night. Sarah could feel it in her chest, a pressure that intensified when she walked past the staircase or the master bedroom window. She knew that the walls remembered, that the shadows retained a presence, and that the fear of being watched had not fully dissipated. Her mind raced constantly, each creak or tap a potential sign that something was still there, waiting, observing, and possibly planning. Each night felt like a replay of the past. Sarah would lay awake, listening to the faintest sounds, the settling of the house, the wind brushing against the windows, or the occasional soft tap on the floorboards. Her imagination would fill in the rest, painting vivid images of a lurking figure, watching silently from above. Even during the day, her mind could not escape the memory. Shadows seemed deeper, corners darker, and every locked door a reminder that the house could hide things she could never fully understand. She began to avoid walking through certain hallways alone, and sometimes she hesitated at the top of the stairs, fearing that something might be waiting just out of sight. The house had transformed from a safe place to a constant source of dread, and she realized that the terror of that night was not just a memory. It was a lingering presence, one that she could never fully escape. One particularly stormy night, Sarah returned to the house for another babysitting shift. Rain battered the windows with relentless force, and the wind howled as if echoing her own anxiety. The children were asleep, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of the storm. Every creak of the floorboards sounded amplified. Every shadow seemed to pulse with life. Sarah tried to read a book, but her eyes kept darting to the dark corners of the room. Suddenly, the phone rang, shattering the fragile sense of calm. She picked it up with trembling hands, half expecting silence or another cruel prank. But this time, a chilling whisper spoke clearly. "I see you." Sarah's heart stopped. The storm outside seemed to fade into a heavy, suffocating quiet, leaving only the sound of her own rapid breathing and the whisper that promised she was not alone, even in the safety of daylight memory. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to flee, but she forced herself to remain calm, carefully placing the phone down. The children slept peacefully, oblivious to the terror that had returned. She crept through the living room, noticing subtle signs: the couch cushions slightly askew, the faint scuff marks along the hallway floor, as if someone had walked just moments before. Her pulse raced with every step, and shadows seemed to stretch toward her with intent. She reached the staircase, every nerve in her body screaming that she should turn back. Yet she continued upward, each step heavy with dread. As she reached the top, she noticed the master bedroom door slightly ajar, though she was certain she had closed it earlier. A cold draft escaped, brushing against her skin, and she felt the unmistakable presence of someone or something watching her from the darkness. In the dim glow of the hallway light, Sarah approached the door cautiously. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and each step echoed ominously. She glanced inside the master bedroom and froze. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching unnaturally, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she saw a figure standing near the far wall. It was motionless, faceless, its presence exuding a silent, chilling menace. Sarah's body trembled as memories of that previous night flooded her mind, the whispers, the taps, the relentless fear. She realized with a jolt that the intruder's terror was no longer confined to a single person. It had become an echo in the house itself, a lingering force feeding on fear. Each breath she took felt heavier, each heartbeat more urgent, and the house seemed to pulse around her, alive with memories she could neither understand nor escape. Sarah felt her courage waning, yet a protective instinct for the children propelled her forward. She moved quietly toward Emily's room, checking under the bed, around the closet, and behind the door. Everything seemed normal, too normal. The eerie stillness of the house made her skin crawl. She tried to shake off the fear, telling herself that it was only her mind playing tricks, that the storm and her imagination were conspiring to make the night unbearable. Yet deep down, she knew something was different. There was an intelligence in the darkness, a patient observer lying in wait. The familiar creaks of the floorboards became almost like footsteps, following her at a distance, taunting her. Sarah realized that the intruder's presence was no longer bound by flesh and blood. It had become something more, a lingering, sentient fear that would not be ignored. Hours passed, and Sarah sat in the living room, clutching a blanket and trying to calm her racing heart. The children slept soundly, oblivious to the tension that had filled the house. Every once in a while, a soft tap or faint creak reminded her that she was not truly alone. Her eyes darted constantly, scanning the dimly lit corners for any sign of movement. The house itself seemed to breathe around her, expanding and contracting with an uncanny rhythm. Memories of the intruder's whispered threats haunted her, merging with new sensations that she could not explain. The atmosphere felt electric, charged with anticipation, as if the house were holding its breath for a final act. Sarah realized she could not escape the sensation that the previous night's horror had left an indelible mark, and that fear was no longer just a memory. It had become a companion, lingering quietly in the corners, waiting for her attention. In a burst of desperation, Sarah fled down the stairs. The children clutched tightly against her chest. The front door loomed ahead, light spilling from the porch, offering a tangible promise of safety. With every ounce of strength, she bolted through the house, ignoring the creaks, the taps, and the shadows that reached toward her. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving an eerie calm over the property. She ran to her car, the children safe but trembling, and drove without looking back. Even as she sped away, she could feel the weight of the house lingering, a suffocating presence that refused to leave completely. Though she had escaped the immediate danger, Sarah understood that some terrors never truly vanish. They remain, waiting, embedded in memory and walls alike. Weeks later, Sarah could no longer bring herself to enter the Anderson household. Even from a distance, the house exuded an oppressive energy, as if the shadows inside were waiting for someone foolish enough to return. Sleep became difficult, the whisper of footsteps and distant creaks haunting her dreams. She would see fleeting shadows in peripheral vision, hear the faintest taps on unseen floors, feel eyes watching her from darkness that should have been empty. Friends and family reassured her that she was safe, that the intruder had been arrested, but she knew better. The house had left a permanent mark on her psyche, a shadow of fear that could flare at any moment. And late at night, when all is quiet, she sometimes swears she can hear a familiar voice whispering from the darkness, "I never left." Even months later, Sarah tried to convince herself she was safe, but the fear never fully left her. At night, as she lay in bed, she could swear she heard the faint creak of stairs outside her room, the soft whisper of a voice she hoped never to hear again. Shadows seemed to twitch and stretch in corners that should have been empty, and her own reflection in the mirror sometimes felt wrong, as if it was watching her back. One evening, as she checked on the children at a friend's house, safe, far from the haunted Anderson home, her phone buzzed. A text appeared, simple, chilling, and impossible to trace. "I'm still upstairs." Sarah dropped the phone, her heart pounding so violently it felt as if it might burst. In that instant, she realized the terror she had faced was never truly gone. It had merely found a way to follow her, a silent shadow, always watching, always waiting.